The woman stepping off the dusty stagecoach in Murphy's, California in the summer of 1869, looked like she had already died once and was walking through the world as a ghost. Her auburn hair hung limp beneath a faded bonnet, and her green eyes held such emptiness that the driver actually flinched when he helped her down. She carried a single worn carpetbag and wore a dress that had seen better days, but what struck Ethan Morrison most as he waited by his wagon was the way she moved, as if every step required immense courage. He had placed the advertisement 6 months ago, never really expecting a response. A rancher in his late 20s with more land than he could properly manage alone, living in a rough mining town where respectable women were scarce. He had written the letter on a whiskey-fueled night of loneliness. When her reply came, written in elegant script, he had been surprised. Her name was Julia Norton. She was 22, and she was alone in the world. She wrote that she sought a new beginning far from Philadelphia, that she was healthy and capable, and that she understood the arrangement would be one of practical partnership first. What she had not written was that she could not speak. Ethan removed his hat as he approached, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Murphy's was bustling today, miners heading to and from the hills, freight wagons rumbling past, the sound of a piano already jangling from one of the saloons even though it was barely noon. He was tall, broad-shouldered from years of hard work, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of strong coffee. His face was weathered but kind, and right now it showed concern. "Miss Norton?" he asked, though he knew it had to be her. She was the only woman on the stage. She nodded just once, and her hand tightened on the handle of her bag. "I am Ethan Morrison. I hope your journey was not too difficult." He tried to keep his voice gentle, undemanding. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw fear flash through those green eyes before she carefully composed her face into neutrality. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no sound came. Her lips trembled and she closed them again, her face flushing with what looked like shame. Ethan waited, giving her time, but when the silence stretched and he saw the panic beginning to build in her expression, he said quietly, "The wagon is just here. Let me take your bag." She hesitated, then released it to him. It was lighter than he expected, and the thought of this woman traveling 2,000 miles with so little made his chest ache. He led her to the wagon, acutely aware of the stares from passers-by. News traveled fast in a town like Murphy's, and by nightfall, everyone would know that Ethan Morrison's mail-order bride had arrived and apparently could not speak. He helped her onto the wagon seat, and she arranged her skirts with mechanical precision, her hands never quite still. When he climbed up beside her and took the reins, she kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, her shoulders rigid with tension. The ride to his ranch took nearly an hour, following a winding road that climbed into the foothills. The land here was beautiful, golden grass studded with dark oaks, the Sierra Nevada rising in the distance. Ethan usually loved this drive, but today the silence felt oppressive. He wanted to ask her what had happened, wanted to know why she could not speak, but he also recognized the signs of deep trauma. He had seen enough during the war to know that some wounds could not be seen. "The ranch is called the Mesa Verde," he said, feeling foolish talking to someone who could not respond, but unable to bear the quiet. "It is about 300 acres, mostly cattle, some horses. I have 2 hired hands who come during the busy seasons, but mostly it is just me. The house is small but sturdy. I built it myself 4 years ago when I bought the land." She did not react, but he saw her fingers relax slightly where they gripped the edge of the seat. "I should tell you," he continued, "that I do not expect anything from you right away. I know this is a strange situation, and I can see that you have been through something difficult. We can take our time figuring out how this will work." At that, she did turn to look at him, surprise clear on her face. He met her gaze steadily, trying to convey sincerity. Up close, he could see faint scars on her throat, barely visible, and his jaw tightened as he understood. She had not simply lost her voice. Someone had hurt her. When they arrived at the ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. The house was indeed small, a simple structure of wood and stone with a covered porch, but it was well maintained. A barn stood nearby, and beyond it were the pastures where his cattle grazed. It was not grand, but it was honest work and honest land, and Ethan took pride in it. He helped her down from the wagon and carried her bag to the house. Inside, it was cool and dim. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace at one end and a simple table with chairs. A rocking chair sat near the fireplace, and shelves lined one wall filled with books. 2 doors led to the bedrooms. "That one is mine," Ethan said, pointing to the door on the left. "This one is yours." He opened the right-hand door to reveal a small but clean room with a bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. "I know it is not much, but it is yours. You can do with it as you please." She stepped into the room slowly, setting her bag on the bed. When she turned back to him, there were tears in her eyes, and he saw her throat work as she tried to speak, but again, nothing came. "It is all right," he said softly. "You do not have to say anything." She shook her head, frustration clear on her face. She looked around desperately, then moved past him to the main room. She found a piece of paper on his desk and a pencil, and she wrote quickly, her hand shaking. "I am sorry. I should have told you. I understand if you want to send me back." Ethan read it and felt something twist in his chest. "No," he said firmly. "You are here now, and this is your home if you want it to be. I meant what I said in my letters. I was looking for a partner, someone to share this life with. Speech is not a requirement for that." She stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. Then she wrote again. Why what?" he asked. "Why would you still want me?" He pulled out a chair from the table and sat down, gesturing for her to do the same. After a moment, she did. "Miss Norton," he began, then paused. "May I call you Julia?" She nodded. "Julia, I am not a complicated man. I have this ranch and I work hard to keep it running, but at the end of the day, I come back to an empty house. I eat alone, I sleep alone, and sometimes weeks go by where the only conversations I have are with my cattle. I placed that advertisement because I wanted a companion, someone to build a life with. I will not lie and say I am not surprised by your silence, but I am not disappointed. If anything, I am more curious about who you are and what brought you here." She looked down at her hands, and he saw them trembling. After a long moment, she picked up the pencil and began to write. It took several minutes, and he waited patiently. When she finally turned the paper toward him, his anger on her behalf was immediate and fierce. "My father was a drunk. When my mother died 3 years ago, he became worse. He blamed me. One night when I tried to stop him from going to the tavern, he became violent. He choked me until I passed out. When I woke, I could not speak. The doctor said my voice might come back in time, but it never has. My father died 6 months ago from the drink. I had no other family, no means of support. I saw your advertisement and thought perhaps out here, far from everything, I could start over. I did not tell you because I was afraid you would not want me. I am sorry for deceiving you." Ethan read it twice, then carefully folded the paper. When he looked at her, his expression was grave but not unkind. "You have nothing to apologize for. What happened to you was not your fault, and your father was a bastard. Pardon my language, but it is the truth. As for deceiving me, I do not see it that way. You were protecting yourself and you had every right to." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, and this time she did not try to hide them. He wanted to reach across the table and take her hand to offer some comfort, but he sensed she was not ready for that. Instead, he stood and went to the stove. "You must be hungry. I am not the best cook, but I can manage a decent stew. Why do not you rest a bit? Wash up if you would like. There is a pump out back and a washroom through that door. Take your time." She nodded and rose, moving back to her room. He heard the door close softly and he let out a long breath. This was not what he had expected, but as he began preparing dinner, he realized he did not regret it. There was something about Julia that called to him, a strength beneath the fear, a will to survive that he recognized and admired. Over the following days, they developed a rhythm. Julia was an early riser, and Ethan would find her already in the kitchen when he emerged from his room, making coffee or starting breakfast. She moved through the house like a shadow at first, hesitant and uncertain, but gradually she began to relax. She kept paper and pencil with her always, and they communicated through a combination of her written words, gestures, and expressions. He found himself becoming quite adept at reading her face, learning to distinguish between her genuine smiles and the polite ones, understanding when she was tired or overwhelmed. She was skilled in the domestic tasks, and the house began to transform under her care. Curtains appeared in the windows, sewn from fabric she had brought in her bag. The shelves were reorganized, the floors swept clean every day. She baked bread that was far better than anything he had managed, and she turned his simple meals into something approaching fine dining. But what surprised him most was her interest in the ranch. On the third day, she had written, "May I see the cattle?" He had taken her out to the pastures, expecting her to observe from a distance, but instead she had moved among the animals fearlessly. She had a gentleness that calmed them, and she studied everything with keen intelligence. When they returned to the house, she wrote a full page of observations and questions about the herd, the breeding program, the pasture rotation. He found himself explaining his entire operation to her, and she listened, or rather read, with complete attention. "You know about ranching?" he had asked, surprised. She had written, "My grandfather had a farm outside Philadelphia. I spent summers there as a child. I always loved the animals." It was the first piece of her past that was not painful, and he had smiled. "Then I will teach you everything, if you want to learn." Her face had lit up with the first real joy he had seen from her, and something in his chest had shifted at the sight. 2 weeks after her arrival, Ethan had to go into town for supplies. He asked Julia if she wanted to accompany him, but she had shaken her head quickly, fear flickering across her face. He had not pushed, understanding that facing the stares and whispers of the townspeople was more than she could handle yet. He returned to find her in the pasture with his best mare, a temperamental creature named Rosie, who usually only tolerated him. Julia was brushing her, and the horse was standing perfectly still, her eyes half closed in pleasure. When Rosie spotted Ethan, she tossed her head and Julia turned, her hand moving soothingly along the mare's neck. "I see you have made a friend," Ethan called out, approaching slowly. Julia nodded, a genuine smile on her face. She gestured to the horse, then to herself, and made a writing motion. "You want to tell me something about her?" She nodded eagerly and hurried to the fence where she had left her paper and pencil. She wrote quickly, "She is pregnant." "About 3 months, I think." Ethan looked at Rosie, then back at Julia. "Are you certain?" Julia nodded firmly and wrote more. "The way she is carrying herself, the slight swelling, her temperament has changed. I noticed it earlier this week but wanted to be sure before I said anything." Ethan studied the mare carefully and realized Julia was right. "I will be damned," he muttered. "I had not realized. You have a good eye." Julia's smile widened and she looked pleased with herself. It was in that moment, watching her stand in the golden afternoon light with his horse, her hair coming loose from its pins and her face flushed with happiness, that Ethan realized he was falling in love with her. The thought should have terrified him. They barely knew each other, and their arrangement had been meant to be practical. But there was no denying the warmth that spread through him when she smiled, the way he looked forward to their silent breakfasts together, how natural it felt to have her in his space. She fit into his life as if she had always been there, filling empty places he had not even known existed. But he said nothing. She was still healing, still learning to feel safe, and the last thing he wanted was to pressure her or make her uncomfortable in the one place she had found refuge. As summer deepened into August, they settled into partnership. Julia took over the kitchen garden, coaxing vegetables from the earth with impressive skill. She learned to handle the chickens he kept, gathering eggs and even butchering when necessary, though he noticed she always said a silent apology to the birds first. She helped him mend fences, feed the cattle, even assisted when one of the cows had trouble birthing. She was unafraid of hard work, and she never complained, not even with her written words. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. Sometimes he would read aloud from his books, and she would listen with her eyes closed, her face peaceful. Other times they would simply sit in companionable silence, and he began to understand what he had told her that first day was true. Her silence spoke louder than words. In her quietness, there was a depth of feeling, a presence that was more powerful than any conversation. One evening in late August, a stranger rode up to the ranch. Ethan was immediately on guard, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle he kept near the door. Julia, who had been setting the table for dinner, went pale and stepped back into the shadows. The man who dismounted was young, perhaps 25, with a marshal's badge on his chest and a friendly face. "Evening," he called out. "I am looking for Ethan Morrison." "You found him," Ethan replied, stepping onto the porch but keeping himself between the marshal and the house. "What can I do for you, Marshal?" "Name is Deputy Carson Fields. I am out from Sacramento, tracking a couple of men who robbed a stagecoach near Jackson. Wondering if you have seen anything unusual in the past few days. Anyone passing through?" "No, nothing." "It is pretty quiet out here," Ethan said. "When did this happen?" 3 days ago. They got away with a strongbox, shot the driver. He will live, but it was a near thing." Carson's eyes drifted to the house, where Julia's silhouette was visible through the window. "Is that your wife?" "Yes," Ethan said, and felt only a small twinge at the lie. They had not officially married, had not even discussed it, but he felt protective of her reputation. "Might I trouble you for some water? It has been a long ride." Ethan could not refuse without seeming suspicious, so he nodded. "Of course. Wait here." He went inside to find Julia pressed against the wall, her eyes wide with fear. He touched her arm gently. "It is all right. He is just a deputy looking for some robbers. He wants water. You do not have to come out." She shook her head and grabbed her paper, writing quickly. "If I hide, he will think something is wrong. I will come out, but please stay close." "Always," he promised. They walked out together, and Ethan handed the deputy a ladle of cool water from the pump. Carson drank gratefully, then tipped his hat to Julia. "Madam, pleased to meet you." Julia nodded politely, and Ethan saw her fingers twisting in her skirt. "Your husband said you have not seen anyone suspicious around here," Carson continued conversationally. "You would let us know if you do, would you not? These men are dangerous." Julia nodded again, and Carson's brow furrowed slightly. "Are you all right, madam? You look frightened." Before Ethan could answer, Julia stepped forward and gestured to her throat, then shook her head. She then made a writing motion. She cannot speak, Ethan said quietly, but she understands you fine. Oh, Carson said, looking surprised and then sympathetic. I apologize, madam. I did not mean to make you uncomfortable. He looked back at Ethan. Well, if you do see anything, there is a telegraph office in Murphy's. We would be grateful for any information. Of course, Ethan agreed. After Carson rode away, Julia sagged against the porch rail, relief evident in every line of her body. Ethan stood beside her, watching the deputy disappear down the road. You handled that well, he said softly. She turned to look at him, and in the fading light her eyes seemed darker, more vulnerable. She reached for the paper she had tucked in her pocket and wrote. I was afraid he would ask questions, afraid someone from Philadelphia might be looking for me. Why would someone be looking for you? Ethan asked, concerned. She hesitated, then wrote more. My father had debts. After he died, the men he owed money to came to the house. They said I had to pay. I had nothing to give them. I was afraid they might try to force me into working for them. That is why I left so quickly. I am not running from the law, but I am running. Ethan felt cold fury wash through him. If anyone comes here looking for you, they will have to go through me. You are under my protection now, Julia. You are safe here. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something she had never done before. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. Her skin was warm and calloused from work, and the simple touch sent electricity through him. I mean it, he said, his voice rough. I will keep you safe. She nodded, and when she released his hand, he felt the loss of her touch immediately. September brought cooler weather and the start of the harvest season. They worked together to bring in the vegetables from the garden, and Julia spent long days canning and preserving. The shelves in the pantry filled with jars of tomatoes, beans, pickles, and jam. Ethan helped when he could, though his main focus was preparing the cattle for the drive to market in October. They had grown comfortable with each other, their communication now almost effortless. He could tell what she needed often before she wrote it down, and she seemed to understand his moods and thoughts with similar clarity. But there was an awareness growing between them, a tension that was not uncomfortable but was definitely present. He would catch her watching him sometimes, her expression thoughtful, and he wondered what she saw. One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, she handed him a piece of paper. He had learned to recognize when she had something important to say because she would write it out beforehand, taking her time to find the right words. This note read, You have been very kind to me, kinder than anyone has ever been. I want you to know that I am grateful. When I came here, I thought this would be a marriage of convenience, a practical arrangement. I did not expect to find a friend. I did not expect to find someone who would see me as more than my silence, more than my damage. You have given me a home and a purpose, and I will never forget that. But I also want you to know that if you have changed your mind about this arrangement, I understand. You did not agree to a wife who cannot speak. If you want to end this, I will find another way. Ethan read it twice, his heart pounding. Then he set the paper aside and turned to face her fully. She was looking at him with those expressive green eyes, waiting for his answer, braced for rejection. Julia, he said slowly, I need to be honest with you. I have changed my mind about this arrangement, but not in the way you think. He took a breath, knowing he was taking a risk but unable to hold back any longer. When I sent for a mail-order bride, I was looking for companionship, for help with the ranch, for someone to share meals with. What I got was so much more. Over these past months, you have become essential to my life. Not because you cook and clean, not because you help with the cattle, but because of who you are. You are strong, Julia. You are brave and kind and intelligent, and every day I discover something new about you that amazes me. She was staring at him, her lips parted in surprise, and he continued, needing to say it all now that he had started. Your silence does not bother me. In fact, I have come to love it because it has taught me to pay attention in ways I never did before. I watch your face, your hands, the way you move, and I see everything you cannot say out loud. Your silence speaks louder than words ever could. What I am trying to tell you, and doing a poor job of it, is that I have fallen in love with you. Completely and utterly in love with you. And if you do not feel the same way, that is all right. You can stay here as long as you want and I will never pressure you, but I needed you to know the truth. Tears were streaming down her face now, and she grabbed for her paper with shaking hands. She wrote frantically, "You love me." "Yes," he said simply, "I love you. Even though I cannot speak, even though I am broken, you are not broken," he said fiercely. "You are wounded, and that is different. Wounds can heal, and yes, even though you cannot speak. I do not love you despite your silence, Julia. I love all of you, silence included." She was crying openly now, and she wrote, "I love you too. I have for weeks, but was afraid to hope you might feel the same. I thought you were just being kind, that you pitied me." "Never pity," he said. "Admiration, yes. Respect, absolutely. Love, more than I can express. But never pity." She set down the pencil and stood, and he rose to meet her. For a moment they simply looked at each other, and then she stepped forward into his arms. He held her carefully at first, afraid of frightening her, but she pressed closer, her face buried in his chest. He felt her shoulders shake with sobs, and he simply held her, one hand stroking her hair, letting her release months or perhaps years of pent-up emotion. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and her eyes red, but she was smiling. She touched his face gently, her fingertips tracing his jawline, and then she stood on her toes and kissed him. It was soft and tentative, and it was the most perfect moment of his life. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "Will you marry me? Properly, I mean. I know we had an arrangement, but I want it to be real. I want you to be my wife in every sense, if you want that too." She nodded vigorously, her smile brilliant, and grabbed her paper. "Yes. Yes. 1,000 times yes." They were married a week later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Murphy's. The pastor, an elderly man named Reverend Thomas, did not seem bothered by Julia's silence, and when he asked if she took Ethan to be her husband, she nodded with such joy that everyone present smiled. Ethan had invited his 2 ranch hands and a few of the more respectable townspeople, wanting Julia to feel welcomed into the community. If anyone thought it strange that the bride did not speak her vows aloud, they were polite enough not to mention it. After the ceremony, there was a small gathering at the ranch. The women of the town had brought food, and despite his initial worry about how they would treat Julia, they seemed genuinely kind. Several of them had brought gifts, simple things like dish towels and preserves, and one older woman named Martha took Julia aside and handed her a beautiful quilt. "I made this for my own wedding 40 years ago," Martha said. "My husband passed 5 years back, and I have no children to give it to. I would be honored if you would have it." Julia's eyes filled with tears, and she hugged the woman impulsively. Martha patted her back. "You are a brave girl, and Ethan Morrison is a good man. You will be happy together, I think." As the sun set and their guests departed, Ethan and Julia stood together watching the last wagon disappear down the road. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, fitting perfectly against his side. "Are you happy?" he asked. She nodded, then tugged him toward the house. Inside, she led him to their bedroom, the one that had been his but was now theirs. She had spent the day before moving her things in, combining their lives in this physical way, and now she looked at him with nervous anticipation. "We do not have to do anything you are not ready for," he said gently. "We can take our time. She shook her head and wrote quickly, "I am ready. I want this. I want you." He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and she responded with an eagerness that erased any lingering doubts. They learned each other slowly that night, and he was patient and gentle, constantly watching her face to make sure she was comfortable. When she tensed, he would stop, and she would touch his face and smile, urging him to continue. It was not perfect. There were awkward moments and uncertainties, but it was real and honest and full of love. Afterward, they lay tangled together, her head on his chest, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her back. She was drawing on his skin with her finger, and he realized she was writing. "What does it say?" he asked sleepily. She propped herself up on one elbow and touched his face, then placed her hand over his heart. She pointed to herself, then back to his heart, and the message was clear. "You are in my heart, and you in mine," he whispered. "Forever." The fall cattle drive came and went successfully, and Ethan returned from Sacramento with money enough to see them through the winter and plans for expanding the herd in the spring. Julia had managed the ranch in his absence, with the help of his ranch hands, and he came home to find everything in perfect order. She had even sold eggs and vegetables in town, using a chalkboard to communicate with customers, and had begun to build relationships with the other women. Winter settled over the foothills, bringing rain and occasional snow. The ranch work slowed, and they spent long evenings by the fire. Ethan taught Julia to play chess, and she beat him regularly, much to his amused chagrin. She was working on a quilt of her own, and he was repairing tack and tools. Often they would simply sit together, reading or working on their separate projects, comfortable in the quiet intimacy they had built. In December, Julia began feeling ill in the mornings. At first, Ethan worried she had caught something, but when the pattern continued and he noticed other small changes, he began to suspect the truth. She confirmed it one evening, her note simple but world-changing. "I think I am going to have a baby." The joy he felt was overwhelming. He pulled her into his arms, laughing, and she was crying and smiling at the same time. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby." She nodded, and when she pulled back, she placed his hand on her still flat stomach. The gesture was so tender, so full of trust and hope, that he felt his eyes sting with tears. "Are you happy?" he asked, she wrote. "Happier than I ever thought possible. When I left Philadelphia, I thought I was going to my ending. Instead, I found my beginning." The pregnancy progressed without complications. Julia bloomed, her face losing the last traces of haunted fear and filling out with health and happiness. Ethan was endlessly attentive, perhaps too much so, but she tolerated his fussing with good humor. She continued to help with the ranch work, though he tried to keep her from anything too strenuous, and she spent hours preparing for the baby's arrival, sewing tiny clothes and blankets. The women of Murphy's had fully accepted her now, and several of them visited regularly, bringing gifts and advice. Martha became a particular friend, and her presence seemed to comfort Julia in a maternal way she had been missing. In late April of 1870, on a warm afternoon with wildflowers blooming across the hills, Julia went into labor. Ethan had sent for the midwife at the first signs, and Martha came as well, shooing him out of the room with firm instructions to boil water and stay out of the way. He paced the main room for hours, listening to the sounds from the bedroom and feeling utterly helpless. He understood now why men were traditionally banned from the birthing room. It would drive him mad to watch Julia in pain and be unable to help. But even through the door, he did not hear her cry out. Her labor was as silent as everything else about her, and somehow that made it worse. Finally, as the sun was setting, he heard a new sound, the thin, angry wail of a newborn. He stopped pacing, his heart in his throat, and moments later Martha emerged, smiling. "You have a son," she announced. "A healthy, strong boy, and your wife did beautifully." "Can I see them?" he asked, already moving toward the door. "Give me a moment to help her get settled," Martha said, but she was still smiling. "She is asking for you." "Well, not asking exactly, but you know what I mean." When he was finally allowed into the room, he found Julia propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. He approached slowly, almost afraid, and when she pulled back the blanket to show him their son's face, he felt his world shift on its axis. "He is perfect," Ethan whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "You are perfect." The baby had dark hair like his father and was making small snuffling sounds. Julia looked at Ethan, then at their son, and her expression was one of pure, uncomplicated joy. She adjusted the baby so Ethan could hold him, and he cradled his son with careful reverence. "We need a name," he said. Julia reached for her ever-present paper, but her hands were shaking with exhaustion. "Later," he said gently. "We have time." They named him Samuel Ethan Morrison, and he was the light of their lives. Ethan discovered depths of love he had not known existed, and watching Julia with their son was a daily revelation. She could not sing to him, but she hummed tunelessly, and Samuel seemed perfectly content. She communicated with their baby the same way she communicated with everyone else, through touch and expression, and the bond between them was immediate and fierce. Samuel thrived, growing chubby and happy. By 6 months, he was sitting up, and by his first birthday, he was toddling around the ranch, getting into everything. He was a vocal child, babbling constantly, and Ethan sometimes wondered if he was making up for his mother's silence. Julia did not seem to mind. She would watch her son chattering away and smile with such contentment that Ethan knew she held no sadness about her own inability to speak. The ranch continued to prosper. With the money from the cattle sales and Julia's careful management of the household, they were able to expand the herd and build a second barn. Ethan hired on a full-time ranch hand, a quiet man named Jack who respected Julia's silence and worked hard. Life settled into a rhythm that felt eternal, each season bringing its own tasks and joys. When Samuel was 2, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. This time she was less nervous, more confident, and the pregnancy was easier. In the spring of 1873, she delivered a daughter they named Elizabeth Martha Morrison, after no one in particular but names they both liked, with Martha as the middle name to honor their friend. Elizabeth was different from her brother from the start. Where Samuel had been robust and loud, Elizabeth was delicate and observant. She watched the world with serious gray eyes and rarely cried. As she grew, it became clear she had inherited her mother's quiet nature, though unlike Julia, she could speak. She simply chose not to most of the time, preferring to observe and listen. "She is like you," Ethan told Julia one evening as they watched their children play. Samuel, now 4, was galloping around pretending to be a horse, while Elizabeth, just over a year, sat in the grass examining a flower with intense concentration. Julia smiled and wrote, "She has my soul, he has yours." "Is that a good thing?" he asked. "It is perfect," she wrote. The years passed in a blur of happiness. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the ranch and the animals. He learned to ride almost before he could walk properly, and he followed Ethan everywhere, asking endless questions. Elizabeth remained quiet and thoughtful, but she had a gift with growing things, and by the time she was 5, she had her own corner of the garden that she tended with meticulous care. Both children learned to communicate with their mother in the same way everyone else did, reading her expressions and gestures, understanding her written words. Samuel sometimes forgot that other mothers spoke, and Elizabeth seemed to find the whole thing perfectly natural. They protected their mother fiercely, and when they encountered people who were cruel or dismissive about her silence, both children would rise to her defense with a passion that made Ethan proud. Julia bloomed in motherhood and in her role as a rancher's wife. She had become an integral part of the community, known for her kindness and her skill. When someone was sick or in need, she would appear with food and help, and people learned that her silence did not mean she lacked compassion or capability. Several times, she had assisted with difficult births. Her gentle presence and sure hands welcomed even when she could not offer verbal reassurance. Ethan watched her grow into herself over the years, the fearful, traumatized woman who had stepped off the stagecoach, transforming into someone confident and strong. She still carried the scars of her past. There were still moments when something would trigger a memory, and she would go quiet in a different way, withdrawn and tense. But those moments became less frequent, and she had learned to let him help her through them. One evening in the summer of 1878, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset like they had done countless times before, Julia handed him a letter. He recognized the handwriting as hers, but it was longer than her usual notes, several pages folded together. "What is this?" he asked. She gestured for him to read, so he did. "My dearest Ethan," it began, "I have never been good with spoken words even before I lost my voice. I was always the quiet one, the one who preferred to listen rather than speak. But there are things I need to say to you, things I want to put down in writing so you can keep them and remember. 9 years ago, I stepped off a stagecoach in Murphy's with nothing but a bag of threadbare clothes and a heart full of fear. I thought I was broken beyond repair. I thought I would spend the rest of my life as half a person, never whole, never truly living. You proved me wrong in every possible way. You saw me, really saw me from the very first day. You looked past the silence and the fear and saw the person I could be, the person I wanted to be. You gave me space to heal, time to learn to trust, and a home where I could finally feel safe. You never once made me feel less than whole. These years with you have been the happiest of my life. You have given me children I adore, a home I love, and a purpose that fills me with joy. But more than that, you have given me yourself. Your patience, your kindness, your unwavering support. You have shown me what love truly means. I know that sometimes people feel sorry for you, having a wife who cannot speak. I have seen the pitying looks, heard the whispered comments. But I hope you know that I have never felt sorry for myself, not since I found you. My silence is part of who I am, and you have helped me see it not as a limitation but simply as a difference. You once told me that my silence speaks louder than words, and you have spent every day since proving that you meant it. I want you to know that I would choose this life, this silence, all over again if it meant I could be with you. You are my heart, my home, my everything. Thank you for loving me, for seeing me, for building this beautiful life with me. I love you more than words could ever express, which is perhaps appropriate given that I have no words to express it with. But I hope you feel it every day in the way I look at you, in the way I touch you, in the life we have built together. Forever yours, Julia. By the time Ethan finished writing, his vision was blurred with tears. He folded the letter carefully and looked at his wife, this woman who had come to him wounded and afraid and had become his entire world. "Julia," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you are the strongest, bravest, most remarkable person I have ever known. I am the one who is grateful, every single day, that you stepped off that stagecoach and gave me a chance. You did not need words to change my life completely. Your silence speaks volumes, and I hear every word. She was crying too, and she moved into his arms, fitting against him the way she always had, perfectly. They sat there as the sun set, holding each other, and Ethan thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. All the pain, the fear, the uncertainty, it had all led to this. A love deeper than any ocean, a family that filled their hearts, a life that was more than either of them had dared to dream. In the house behind them, they could hear Samuel reading to Elizabeth, his voice animated as he brought the story to life. In the barn, the horses shuffled and settled for the night. The cattle lowed softly in the distance, and somewhere a coyote called to the rising moon. This was their life, built from nothing, sustained by love, enriched by the silence that had once seemed like a curse, but had become a blessing. Julia had been right when she wrote that she had found her beginning in what she thought was her ending, but it was more than that. They had both found their beginning, their middle, and the promise of an ending that would come many, many years in the future, when they were old and gray and surrounded by grandchildren who would learn, as their children had, that love does not require words. It requires only an open heart, a willingness to listen, and the understanding that sometimes the most profound truths are spoken in silence. The years that followed continued in much the same blessed pattern. Samuel grew into a strong young man who shared his father's love for the land and his mother's quiet determination. At 18, he was already taking on more responsibility for the ranch, and Ethan knew that one day the Morrison ranch would pass into capable hands. Elizabeth, now 15, had blossomed into a thoughtful young woman with her mother's grace and her father's steady heart. She had decided she wanted to be a teacher, and she spent her free time tutoring the younger children in Murphy's. Like her mother, she had a gift for communication that went beyond words, and the children responded to her patient, gentle guidance. In 1884, on a crisp October afternoon, Ethan and Julia celebrated 15 years of marriage with a gathering at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, bringing food and gifts and good wishes. Martha, now well into her 80s but still sharp as a tack, gave a toast. "I have known this couple since they wed," she said, raising her glass, "and I have watched them build something rare and precious. In a world that often values talk over action, noise over substance, they have shown us all that true communication comes from the heart. To Ethan and Julia Morrison, may you have many more years of happiness." Everyone cheered, and Julia, standing beside Ethan with his arm around her waist, smiled with unabashed joy. She had never looked more beautiful to him, her auburn hair now threaded with silver, her face lined with laughter and life. That night, after everyone had gone and the children were asleep, they returned to their spot on the porch. It had become their ritual, this evening time together, and they guarded it jealously. 15 years, Ethan mused. It seems like yesterday, and it seems like forever. Julia pulled out a small note she had prepared. "Both. It is both. Every day with you is new, and yet I cannot remember a time when you were not part of me." "I feel the same," he said, pulling her closer. "Do you ever regret it, coming here, taking such a risk?" She shook her head firmly and wrote, "Never, not for a single moment. This is where I was always meant to be. With you." "I love you," he said, as he had said 1,000 times before and would say 1,000 times more. "Your silence speaks louder than words ever could, and I hear everything you cannot say." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, and in that kiss was everything. Gratitude and love, passion and partnership, the promise of all the years yet to come. Samuel married in 1886 to a kind young woman named Rebecca who worked at the general store in Murphy's. The wedding was held at the ranch, and Julia cried happy tears as she watched her son pledge his life to another. Ethan held her hand throughout the ceremony, knowing she was thinking of their own wedding, of how far they had come. A year later, Samuel and Rebecca presented them with their first grandchild, a boy they named Ethan James Morrison. Julia was utterly besotted with her grandson, spending hours with him, and the baby seemed to find his grandmother's humming just as soothing as any lullaby. Elizabeth left for Sacramento in 1887 to attend a teaching college, but she came home every chance she got, bringing stories of her studies and her growing circle of friends. She had inherited her mother's strength and her father's heart, and both parents knew she would do remarkable things. The ranch continued to thrive under Samuel's increasingly capable management, and Ethan found himself with more time to simply enjoy life. He and Julia took long rides through the hills, revisiting all their favorite spots, making new memories in places already rich with them. One spring morning in 1890, Ethan woke to find Julia sitting at the window, watching the sunrise. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and she leaned back into him with a contented sigh. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She reached for her paper, always close at hand after all these years, and wrote, "How blessed I am, how grateful. I came here broken and alone, and you gave me everything. A home, a family, a purpose, love. You gave me my life back, Ethan. You gave me myself back." "No," he said gently, turning her to face him. "You did that yourself. I just loved you while you healed. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Julia. You survived things that would have destroyed others, and you built a life of meaning and joy from the ashes. I am the one who is blessed. You are the one who speaks to me every day without words, who shows me what real strength looks like, what real love means." She touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that time had carved there, and her eyes were bright with emotion. She wrote one more line. "Together. We did it together." "Yes," he agreed, kissing her forehead. "Together, always together." As the sun rose higher, painting the California hills in shades of gold and green, they stood wrapped in each other's arms. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, who had built from nothing something extraordinary. The mail-order bride who could not speak and the rancher who had learned to listen had created a love story that would be told in Murphy's for generations. A testament to the power of patience, understanding, and the simple truth that sometimes silence really does speak louder than words. In the years that followed, their family continued to grow. More grandchildren came, filling the house with laughter and noise that Julia welcomed with open arms. Elizabeth returned from Sacramento with a husband of her own, a gentle man who worked at a bank and adored his quiet wife. They settled in Murphy's, and Elizabeth took a position at the local school, where she became beloved by students and parents alike. Ethan and Julia grew old together with grace, their love deepening with each passing year. They remained active on the ranch as long as they were able, but gradually they passed more and more responsibility to Samuel, content to spend their days in each other's company. On a summer evening in 1895, as they sat on their porch watching yet another magnificent sunset, Ethan looked at his wife of 26 years and felt the same surge of love he had felt that first day when she stepped off the stagecoach, lost and afraid. "I would not change a single thing," he said suddenly. "Not one moment, not one decision. It has all been perfect." Julia smiled, that warm, genuine smile that still had the power to make his heart skip, and she wrote her response. "Perfect. That is the right word. Our life has been perfect, not because it was easy or without pain, but because we built it together, with love and patience and understanding. You saw past my silence to who I really was, and you loved all of me. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." She paused, then added, "Thank you for hearing me, even when I could not speak. Thank you for a lifetime of listening." "Thank you for trusting me enough to let me in," he replied. "Thank you for choosing me, for building this life with me. Your silence has taught me more than words ever could. It taught me to pay attention, to really see people, to understand that communication is about so much more than talking. You speak to me every day, Julia, in 1,000 different ways, and I will never stop listening." They sat together as the stars began to emerge, holding hands the way they had for decades, comfortable in their silence, rich in their love. Around them, the ranch settled into night, the culmination of years of hard work and dedication. In the house, they could hear their grandchildren playing, the sound of family and life continuing. This was their legacy. Not just the land they had tended or the cattle they had raised, but the love they had built, the family they had created, the proof that silence could be golden, that words were not necessary when hearts were open, that trauma could be healed and fear could be overcome with patience and understanding. Julia, the mail-order bride who came west with nothing but pain and fear, had found her voice in the silence. And Ethan, the rancher who had been searching for a partner, had found so much more. He had found his soulmate, his best friend, the love of his life, all in a woman whose silence spoke volumes. As they rose to go inside, ready to end another perfect day in a lifetime of perfect days, Ethan pulled Julia close one more time. "I love you," he whispered, as he had every day since he first said those words. "And I always will." She looked up at him, her green eyes still bright despite the years, and though she said nothing, he heard her response as clearly as if she had shouted it from the rooftops. It was in her smile, in the way she touched his face, in the hand she placed over his heart. She loved him too. She always had, and she always would. And really, what more was there to say?